The jazz from the speakeasy downstairs thumped through the walls of our penthouse apartment, a sultry rhythm that should have belonged to us. It was the kind of night where the city pulsed with an electrocom, where lovers whispered secrets in dimly lit corners, and where fortunes were made, or lost, over a single hand of poker. I should have been out until dawn, as I always was on Fridays, drinking with the boys at the Starlight Club, shaking hands with men who ran the city from the shadows. Instead, a headache and a rare impulse to surprise my wife brought me home early. That's when I saw it. Eleanor's silk robe was draped carelessly over the armchair, as if she had shed it in haste. The scent of jasmine and vanilla still lingered in the air, her scent, but there was something else beneath it. A trace of cologne. Not mine. And then, there was the fedora. A man's hat, perched on my nightstand like it belonged there. Like he belonged there. I didn't need to push open the bedroom door to know what I would find. Some truths announced themselves in the details, the hurried way her perfume clung to the air, the suspender straps lying discarded by the bed, the faint creak of the mattress. I stepped back into the hallway, my pulse steady, my breath controlled. Rage, humiliation, and something worse, something hollow, settled into my chest. But I didn't burst in. I didn't shout, didn't make a scene. Patience is a weapon. I pulled my pocket watch from my vest, flicked it open. 11:47 p.m. I let the lid snap shut, placed it back in my pocket, and left as quietly as I had come. Eleanor thought she was clever. Thought I was just another fool in her orbit, too blinded by love to see the lipstick smudges on our carefully painted life. She was wrong. Over the coming weeks, I would gather every piece of the puzzle, every secret whispered in dark corners, every alibi that didn't quite fit. I would unravel her deceit thread by thread, until she stood before me with nowhere left to hide. Because in this city, secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks. And by the time I was finished, Eleanor and her lover would learn just how unforgiving a betrayed man can be. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my study, a glass of bourbon in one hand, my pocket watch in the other, listening to the jazz drifting up from the streets below. It was a cruel melody, sultry, teasing, filled with the kind of passion that should have been mine. At 2:14 a.m., I heard the soft click of our apartment door closing. Eleanor was careful, but not careful enough. Her heels barely made a sound against the marble floor, and when she passed my door, she hesitated. I could hear her breathing, steadying herself, smoothing out any lingering signs of sin. Then, as if nothing had happened, she walked to our bedroom. I swirled the bourbon in my glass, watching the way the amber liquid clung to the sides. I could have followed her. Could have demanded an explanation right then and there. But what good would it do? She would lie, of course. A woman like Eleanor always had a story ready, always knew how to twist the truth just enough to make you doubt your own eyes. No, I needed something more. Proof. The next morning, she played the role of the devoted wife with sickening ease. She kissed my cheek at breakfast, laughed at my half-hearted jokes, poured my coffee just the way I liked it. If I hadn't seen the fedora with my own eyes, I might have believed her. But then she made a mistake. She leaned over the table to butter a slice of toast, and her silk robe, the same one that had been draped over the armchair last night, slipped just enough for me to see it. A bruise. Just beneath her collarbone, half hidden by pearls. A lover's mark. I took a slow sip of coffee and set the cup down with precision. Late night? I asked, keeping my voice casual. She didn't flinch. Margaret had too much to drink at the Ritz. I had to make sure she got home safely. A lie. Margaret was a woman who could drink any man under the table and still walk out with perfect posture. But Eleanor said it so smoothly, so easily, that if I hadn't known the truth, I might have let it slide. I simply nodded. How kind of you. Her eyes flickered to me, searching for something, doubt, suspicion, anything. But I gave her nothing. Instead, I spent the day doing what I did best, gathering information. I started with the Starlight Club, where men drank whiskey like water and spoke in whispers about things they shouldn't. I kept my ear to the ground, listened for any murmurs of Eleanor's name. It didn't take long. Denton's been playing with fire, one of the bartenders said as he wiped down a glass. Fooling around with a married dame. Denton. My fingers tightened around my own glass. It wasn't just any name. Charles Denton. A banker with a taste for expensive suits, expensive liquor, and, apparently, other men's wives. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. Eleanor thought she was careful. She thought her little affair was just a secret whispered between lovers in dimly lit rooms. But secrets in this city have a way of spilling out, slipping between the cracks like cigarette smoke. And now, I had a name. It was time to introduce myself to Mr. Denton. A man like Charles Denton thought himself untouchable. A banker in a city built on dirty money, he was the type who sat in the best seats at the opera, played cards with corrupt politicians, and slipped his hands into places they didn't belong, ledgers, pockets, and, apparently, my wife's silk sheets. I wasn't the first husband he had wronged, but I would be the last. I found him at the Black Swan, a high-end club where men smoked Cuban cigars and whispered about deals that would never see the light of day. Denton was in his usual corner booth, a glass of scotch in one hand, his other draped casually over the back of the seat, where Eleanor had likely been just nights before. I adjusted my cufflinks, took a slow breath, and walked straight to his table. "Mind if I join you?" I didn't wait for an answer. Denton blinked in surprise, but then he smiled, that polished, self-assured grin of a man who had never faced real consequences. "Of course," he said, waving a hand to the seat across from him. "Do I have the pleasure of knowing you?" I settled in, leaning back as if I belonged there. "I think you know exactly who I am." His smile faltered for just a second. A flash of recognition. Then, just as quickly, it returned. "Ah, the husband." He took a sip of his scotch. "I suppose this is the part where you throw a punch, demand satisfaction, maybe challenge me to a duel in the street?" I chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in my own glass. "I'm a businessman, Mr. Denton. Not a fool." He tilted his head, intrigued. "Then what do you want?" I leaned in slightly, just enough for my words to be private but not threatening. "To make you sweat." For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt behind his sharp blue eyes. "I know what you've been doing," I continued, my voice calm, steady. "I know where. I know when. And I know that if certain names, say, the names of a few investors at your bank, found out how you spend your evenings, you'd be out of a job before the ink on your resignation letter dried." He stiffened, but his expression didn't change. "You wouldn't." I smirked. "You don't know me well enough to say that." Silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken threats. The jazz band played on, a sultry tune that felt almost mocking. Then, Denton leaned forward, his confidence returning like a bad habit. "Let's say I end things with Eleanor. Walk away, never see her again. Is that enough to keep your mouth shut?" I studied him for a long moment, then took a slow sip of my drink. "That's a start. Because I didn't just want him to walk away. I wanted to ruin him. And Eleanor? She wasn't off the hook either. The real game was just beginning. Charles Denton left the Black Swan that night looking composed, but I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers twitched slightly as he adjusted his cuffs. He was rattled. Good. But ending the affair wasn't enough. I wanted him to feel what it was like to have something slip through his fingers. To watch the life he so carefully built crumble around him, piece by piece. And Eleanor? She had no idea what was coming. The first thing I did was follow Denton. Not in the obvious way, not lurking in shadows like some dime novel detective, but by being exactly where he least expected me. I let him see me. At his bank, when he stepped out for lunch. At the racetrack, where he placed his careful, calculated bets. Once, I even accidentally ran into him at his barber's, exchanging a casual nod as if we were mere acquaintances. Each time, I watched his composure crack just a little more. A man like Denton could stomach a scandal if it was just about a woman. That, he could spin. A moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment. But his business? His standing in the financial world? That was something else entirely. So, I took my time. I started whispering things in the right ears. Not direct accusations, just hints. A comment here, a question there. Did you hear Denton's been distracted lately? Strange meetings, long absences. Wonder what's keeping him so occupied? Men in his world don't like uncertainty. And once doubt takes root, it spreads fast. As for Eleanor, I let her dig her own grave. I watched her the way a hunter watches prey, letting her think she was safe. She still played the part of the devoted wife, smiling at me over breakfast, making sure my collar was straight before I left the apartment. But she had no idea I had already laid the groundwork. The night of our wedding anniversary, I set the final piece of my plan in motion. I told Eleanor I had an important business dinner and wouldn't be home until late. The disappointment in her voice was convincing. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed it. At exactly 9:30 p.m., I sent a messenger to our apartment with a handwritten note. Meet me at the Ritz. Suite 712. I need to see you. See. She took the bait. By 10:15, I was already in the hotel lobby, watching from the shadows as Eleanor stepped out of a cab. She was dressed for seduction, red silk, pearls, a hint of jasmine trailing behind her. She thought she was going to meet Denton. Instead, she was walking straight into a room filled with New York's most powerful men, bankers, politicians, the kind of people who made and ruined reputations over cocktails and whispered deals. Because I had invited them all. By the end of the night, Charles Denton would be finished. And Eleanor? She would finally know what it felt like to lose everything. The Ritz was the kind of place where secrets were traded like currency, where affairs were whispered behind velvet curtains, and fortunes changed hands with a flick of the wrist. It was fitting, then, that this was where I would destroy my wife's illusions, where I would make sure Charles Denton paid his dues. I arrived early, slipping through the grand entrance unnoticed. Suite 712 was already prepared. Inside, the city's most influential men, bankers, investors, and society's finest lounged with glasses of brandy in hand, unaware that they were about to witness the evening's main attraction. Charles Denton was among them, nursing a drink but looking uneasy. Good. He hadn't expected my invitation. When I had sent it under the guise of a high-stakes business discussion, he had no choice but to come. After all, his reputation relied on appearing in the right rooms with the right men. The clock struck 10:30. A soft knock at the door. Every man in that room turned toward it, their idle chatter pausing, their curiosity piqued. I took a slow sip of my drink before I spoke. That, gentlemen, would be our final guest. I moved to the door, taking my time. The anticipation was almost intoxicating. When I opened it, there she was, Eleanor, standing in the hallway, swathed in red silk, lips painted the color of sin. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, her smile coy. Charles, she breathed, stepping forward, only to freeze the moment she looked past me into the room. The color drained from her face. The smile, the confidence, the entire act shattered in an instant. She tried to speak, but her throat bobbed, no words coming out. Her wide, terrified eyes darted from face to face, men she knew. Men who knew me. Charles Denton shot up from his seat, his glass clinking against the table as he set it down too hard. Eleanor, he said, voice low, warning. But it was too late. The room was silent, but the weight of judgment was deafening. I stepped aside and let Eleanor stumble forward, no longer the radiant, untouchable woman she had thought herself to be. The whispers started almost immediately. A married woman. With Denton? Here? I let the humiliation sink in. Then I spoke, my voice smooth and casual. Gentlemen, I believe you all know my wife. Someone chuckled. Someone else murmured, my God. Eleanor turned to me, her eyes wild, pleading. Henry, let's go somewhere private. Please. Why should we? I mused, swirling my drink. This is a business meeting, isn't it, Denton? Denton was already pale, but now he looked ghostly. He knew what I had done. The scandal, the whispers, it would ruin him. I turned back to Eleanor, lowering my voice so only she could hear. You humiliated me in secret. It's only fair I return the favor in public. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but I felt nothing. No remorse. No pity. Just satisfaction. Because Eleanor's world, the glittering, untouchable world she had built for herself, was collapsing around her. And I was the one who lit the match. Eleanor stood there, caught like a thief with nowhere to run. The red silk of her dress, once a symbol of seduction, now looked desperate, as if she could still charm her way out of this. But no smile, no fluttering of lashes could undo what had just unfolded before New York's most influential men. Her fingers trembled as she reached for me, her voice a breathless whisper. Henry, please. Not like this. Not like this. She hadn't said, it's not what it looks like. She hadn't denied it. Because she couldn't. Charles Denton had sunk back into his chair, gripping his glass like it was the only thing holding him together. His face was unreadable, but the sweat at his temples betrayed him. He understood, as Eleanor did, that they were finished. I turned my attention to the men in the room, lifting my drink in a slow, deliberate toast. A lesson, gentlemen, I said smoothly. A man who cannot be trusted in his private affairs, well, can he be trusted in business? Eyes flickered toward Denton. He knew the game was over. This wasn't just about infidelity. These men weren't just judging his morals, they were calculating risk. And in a world where trust and reputation were currency, Denton had just lost everything. Someone cleared his throat. Henry, I think we should. I waved a hand dismissively, my job here already done. By all means, gentlemen, enjoy your evening. I turned to Eleanor, tilting my head toward the door. Shall we? Her breath hitched, but she nodded, her shame a palpable weight. She knew she had no power here, no leverage left. We walked in silence through the hotel corridor, the heels of my polished shoes clicking against the marble while Eleanor's steps were hesitant, almost faltering. Inside the elevator, she finally found her voice. Why did you do this? I exhaled a quiet laugh. You didn't think I'd let you get away with it, did you? She flinched, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress. You could have just confronted me. We could have it. We could have what? I cut in, turning to face her fully. You had plenty of time to come clean, Eleanor. But instead, you carried on, sneaking in and out of our bed like I wouldn't notice. Her chin trembled, but I wasn't done. You lied to me. Made me play the fool in front of the whole city. But I don't play the fool, Eleanor. Not for you. Not for anyone. The elevator doors slid open. We stepped out, my pace steady, hers unsteady. Once we reached the street, she finally whispered, "Are you going to divorce me?" I turned to her, studying the woman I had once adored, the woman I had built a life with, only to have her toss it aside for a fleeting thrill. The old me might have hesitated, but not now. I already started the paperwork. The sharp intake of her breath was the only satisfaction I needed. Because this was only the beginning of her downfall. The car ride home was silent. Eleanor sat beside me, her hands folded in her lap, her breath coming in shallow, uneven waves. She didn't cry, at least not yet, but I could feel the weight of her mind racing, searching for a way out of the mess she had created. There was no way out. When we pulled up to our building, I stepped out first, holding the door open for her like a gentleman. The last courtesy I would extend to my wife. She hesitated, then stepped onto the pavement, her heels clicking softly against the stone. A passing doorman tipped his hat to me, but I barely acknowledged him. Eleanor walked ahead, her back straight, her pride still intact for now. I followed her up the stairs to our penthouse. She walked in first, the warmth of the apartment wrapping around us as the door shut with a quiet but final click. And then, she collapsed. Not onto the floor, but into the nearest chair, her face falling into her hands. A sharp inhale, one, then two, before the sobs finally broke free. I let her cry. I poured myself a drink, moving with ease around the room that was no longer ours, just mine now. I didn't look at her as I loosened my tie, as I took the first sip of whiskey, letting the burn settle deep. I never wanted to hurt you. Her voice was hoarse, raw. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. Then what exactly did you want, Eleanor? She lifted her head, her eyes red, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Fear? Or just the realization that she had finally lost? I don't know, she whispered. I don't know anymore. I set my drink down, finally meeting her gaze. Well, let me tell you what happens next. She stiffened. You will pack your things, I said, my voice measured, steady. You will leave this apartment tomorrow morning, and you will never set foot in it again. Her lip quivered, but she didn't interrupt. The divorce is already in motion. You will take nothing but your clothes, your personal belongings, and whatever dignity you have left. I let my words sink in before delivering the final blow. And since you were so eager to throw our marriage away, I've made sure you walk away penniless. A sharp gasp. Her fingers clutched the arms of the chair. You. I saw to it weeks ago, I continued smoothly. Before you even knew I had figured you out. The account's in my name? Locked. The money you so enjoyed spending? Gone. Whatever inheritance you were counting on. Rewritten. She shot to her feet. You can't do this. I already have. Her breath came fast and shallow, her chest rising and falling with panic. She took a step toward me, desperate now. Henry, please. We can talk about this. We don't have to end like this. I let out a slow exhale, shaking my head. You ended us the moment you let another man into our bed. Her lips parted as if to argue, as if to weave some new excuse, some final desperate attempt to salvage what little she had left. But she must have seen it in my eyes. There was nothing left to save. For a long moment, she just stood there, her once proud shoulders slumping in defeat. And then, without another word, she turned and walked down the hall. I listened as the bedroom door closed softly behind her. I didn't follow. Didn't check to see if she was packing or crying or cursing my name. Because I no longer cared. Eleanor Denton had belonged to me once. Now? She was nothing more than a cautionary tale. The morning came cold and gray, a thin mist rolling in from the Hudson, curling around the city like ghostly fingers. It suited the occasion. Eleanor's suitcases were already by the door when I stepped into the parlor. She had chosen black gloves and a navy coat, a somber ensemble, morning clothes for the life she was about to lose. She was staring out the window, her back to me, as if committing the view to memory. The city skyline, the glittering promise of New York. She had loved this apartment, this life. And now, it was no longer hers. At the sound of my footsteps, she straightened but didn't turn. So, this is really it. I adjusted my cufflinks, keeping my voice calm. It was over the moment you betrayed me. This is just the conclusion. She let out a shaky breath. And if I begged? If I swore it was a mistake, that I still love you? I exhaled slowly, watching her. For a moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. But love had been replaced by something colder. Sharper. You had your chance, Eleanor. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small envelope, placing it on the table beside her. Your train ticket. She turned then, her eyes searching mine. Where to? Boston. She let out a bitter laugh. Exile, then. You'll land on your feet, I said evenly. You always do. She picked up the envelope, turning it over in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. And what about Charles? Charles Denton. She didn't know. A slow smile curved my lips. He resigned this morning. Eleanor's eyes widened. Lost his position at the bank. His investors pulled their funding after last night. He'll be lucky to find work in Chicago. I shrugged. If I had to guess, I'd say he's on a train right now, heading west. She paled, gripping the envelope tighter. He hadn't come for her. Hadn't fought for her. And now, he was gone. I stepped forward, tilting my head slightly as I studied her one last time. Tell me, Eleanor, was it worth it? A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she said nothing. Good. I reached for the door, pulling it open. The hallway was empty except for the bellhop, waiting by the elevator to carry her bags. Your ride is downstairs. Eleanor swallowed, blinking rapidly as she stepped past me, her perfume, jasmine, and regret lingering in the air between us. She hesitated at the threshold, gripping the doorframe as if she wanted to say something. A plea, an apology, a curse. But she knew better. Without another word, she stepped into the hallway. I didn't watch her go. Didn't look back as the elevator doors slid shut, taking my wife, my former wife, down to a future that no longer included me. The apartment felt impossibly quiet. I poured myself a drink, staring out the window as the morning mist began to lift. New York was awake, alive, waiting. And so was I. Because this wasn't an ending. This was a beginning. To be continued in Part 9. Let me know if you'd like any changes before I continue. Next, ChatGPT. Part 9. The Weight of Silence. The apartment felt different without her. It wasn't just the absence of her perfume lingering in the hallway or the echo of her heels clicking against the marble floors. It was something deeper, something unsettling. The weight of years spent together, of whispered conversations and quiet laughter, had vanished overnight, leaving behind an emptiness I hadn't expected. For 13 years, Eleanor had been a part of my life. Even in her betrayal, she had occupied space in my thoughts, my actions. And now? Now there was only silence. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt nothing. The whiskey in my glass barely burned as I took a slow sip, standing by the window, watching the city move below. People scurried along the sidewalks, cabs honked in protest, neon signs flickered in the early morning light. The world hadn't stopped turning just because my marriage had ended. Neither would I. A knock at the door broke my thoughts. I set down my glass, adjusting my tie before answering. The doorman stood there, holding out a cream-colored envelope. Delivered this morning, sir. I nodded, taking the envelope. The weight of it felt ominous. Unfolding it, I scanned the contents quickly. Charles Denton's departure had been even swifter than I anticipated. Not only had he resigned, but he had left the city entirely. The last I heard, he had taken the first train west, leaving behind his townhouse, his reputation, and, most importantly, Eleanor. A quiet satisfaction settled in my chest. Denton's downfall had been effortless. A whisper in the right ears, a strategic invitation, and the man had unraveled without me ever needing to lift a finger. His life had been built on illusion, and once that illusion cracked, it all came tumbling down. And Eleanor? She had bet on the wrong man. I let the letter slip from my fingers onto the table, the final chapter of their affair now closed. The world outside continued on, indifferent to the destruction of a marriage, the fall of a banker, or the quiet triumph of a man who had lost everything except his dignity. I turned away from the window, reaching for my coat. I had spent too long looking at the wreckage. Now, it was time to build something new. By the time evening fell, the city had taken on its usual rhythm, cars rushing down slick streets, laughter spilling from speakeasies, the pulse of jazz thrumming through the walls of buildings that held more secrets than they did tenants. I wasn't a man to dwell in the past, but even I knew that this wasn't just any night. It was the first night in over a decade that I was truly alone. And I was fine with that. Or so I told myself. I left the apartment just before 9, stepping into the cool night air. The Black Swan wasn't far, a place I had frequented long before Eleanor's betrayal, before I had turned into the kind of man who needed to watch his own wife from the shadows. Inside, the club was alive with smoke and conversation, the kind of place where fortunes were made over a poker table and reputations destroyed with a single misplaced whisper. I took my usual table in the corner, nodding at the bartender, who knew my drink without asking. Then, I waited. Because while some men chased revenge, I had learned the better play was always patience. A few minutes later, she walked in. Not Eleanor, God, no. That chapter had been burned to ash. No, this was someone new. Someone unexpected. She was tall, draped in emerald silk, her dark curls pinned to one side in the fashion of the times. Her red lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite a challenge, just enough of both to hold my attention. She scanned the room, eyes sharp, observant, before she made her way to the bar. A woman like that didn't wander into the Black Swan by accident. And certainly not into my path. The bartender leaned over, murmuring something to her. A second later, she turned, her gaze landing on me. Ah, so she was looking for me after all. I took a slow sip of my drink, letting her come to me. When she reached my table, she didn't ask for permission, just slid into the seat across from me, cool as anything. You're Henry Calloway. Not a question. A statement. I tilted my head slightly. Depends on who's asking. Her lips curved, and she extended a gloved hand. Vivian Sinclair. A name I had heard before, but never from the woman herself. Now, I was intrigued. I took her hand, pressing a brief, polite kiss to the back of her glove. To what do I owe the pleasure? Vivian's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. I hear you've just made an enemy of Charles Denton. I let out a quiet chuckle, swirling the whiskey in my glass. I made an example of him. There's a difference. She leaned in slightly, just enough for me to catch the faintest trace of lavender and something darker underneath, whiskey, perhaps, or a lie she wasn't ready to tell yet. Either way, she murmured, I think you and I might have interests that align. Now that was interesting. I set my glass down, watching her. Go on. Vivian Sinclair smiled, slow and knowing. And just like that, the game had begun again. Vivian Sinclair wasn't just beautiful, she was calculated. The way she leaned in, the way her gloved fingers trailed the rim of her glass before she took a sip, every movement was deliberate. She was playing a game, and from the way her eyes watched me, she knew I was playing one too. Charles Denton isn't the only man who should be worried, she said smoothly, crossing her legs beneath the table. There are others. Men who move money in places they shouldn't. Men who trust the wrong people. I smirked, tilting my head slightly. And which of those categories does your name belong to, Miss Sinclair? She exhaled a soft laugh. Neither. I don't trust anyone. Smart. She reached into her clutch, pulling out a folded piece of paper, and slid it across the table to me. I didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, I took another slow sip of my drink, watching her carefully. I had been burned before. Vivian tapped a single finger against the paper. It's an account list. Offshore money hidden behind shell companies. Some of the biggest names in New York have their hands in it. Denton's name included? I asked. She nodded. Not just his. He was a small player in a much bigger game. Now I was intrigued. I unfolded the paper and scanned the names. Some were familiar, too familiar. These weren't just wealthy men. These were the men who pulled the strings in this city. The ones who sat in the best seats at the opera, whose names weren't printed in the papers unless they paid to have them there. Denton had been a fool. But the men on this list? They were dangerous. I folded the paper neatly, slipping it into my pocket. And what exactly do you expect me to do with this? Vivian tilted her head, her lips curving just enough to let me know she had been waiting for that question. I expect you to do what you do best, Mr. Calloway. I chuckled. And what's that? Destroy them. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, so confident, sent a slow thrill through me. She had done her research. She knew exactly who I was. And the worst part? I liked it. I leaned back in my chair, considering her, considering the weight of what she had just handed me. I had spent the last few months tearing down a man who had betrayed me. Now, it looked like Vivian Sinclair had just given me an empire to burn. And I wasn't sure I had the self-restraint to say no. The weight of the paper in my pocket felt heavier than it should have. Names. Numbers. Power disguised as ink on a page. Vivian Sinclair had just handed me something far more valuable than revenge. She had given me a war. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the table, watching her carefully. And what exactly do you gain from all this? Her smile was slow, deliberate. Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see these men fall. I didn't press her, not yet. Everyone had their own angles in this city. If she was willing to let me set fire to the men who had built their wealth on deception, I didn't need to know her reasons. For now, I glanced around the club. The Black Swan was alive with music and smoke, filled with men who thought they were untouchable. Just like Denton had. Just like the names on that list did. They had no idea their world was about to shift beneath them. I turned back to Vivian, reaching into my pocket and pulling out the slip of paper. I tapped it against the table once before sliding it back into my jacket. There's no going back from this, I warned. She smirked. I never go back, Henry. Only forward. I exhaled slowly, considering my next move. I had spent weeks destroying one man. Now, I had the power to bring down an empire. And God help me. I wanted to. Vivian stood, smoothing out her silk dress, her gloved fingers trailing along the table before she picked up her clutch. I'll be in touch, she murmured before disappearing into the crowd. I watched her go, feeling something stir deep in my chest, not attraction, not yet. Something else. Something dangerous. The drink in my hand had lost its taste. The city outside felt different. Because Eleanor's betrayal had been a lesson. But this? This was the beginning of something far greater. As the jazz band struck up another tune, I finished my drink, smoothed my tie, and walked out into the night. I wasn't a scorned husband anymore. I was a man with power. And I intended to use it. The end. If you like this story, please like and subscribe to the channel.